know a lot of people wonder about the mystique of what happens with a general officer after they leave the military. You know, what life looks like on the back end. You had all this exposure, you had this publicity, these very prevalent roles. What does life look like for you now that you've stepped away from the uniform?
Well, it's pretty awesome, actually. I'm incredibly fortunate. But I'd also just note that, really after I took the uniform off for the final time, took the final pass and review, if you will, and the retirement ceremony, of course, I went to be the director of the CIA, which was an incredible follow-on experience. But since leaving government, I've been the chairman of the KKR Global Institute. KKR is one of the largest investment firms of its type in the world. It's much more than just private equity these days. It's also real assets, energy, infrastructure, real estate. Credit is a huge part of our portfolio. And I've been at KKR during a time when we've grown from $83 billion in assets under management to now 578. And I'm a partner, and it's been quite a ride in that regard. I've also always taught, since leaving government. I taught for 3.5 years every week at the City University of New York Honors College. I had a chair at the University of Southern California for 6 years. That was a 1 week a semester agreement. And I was a senior fellow at Harvard, non-resident for 6 years as well. And currently I am the Kissinger Fellow at Yale's Jackson School of Global Affairs, and I co-lead a seminar in the spring for graduate students that is titled Great Power Competition, which of course feeds back into, needless to say, what I do at KKR. I had a book come out last fall, Conflict, the Evolution of Warfare from 1945 to Ukraine, co-author with the great British historian and author Andrew Roberts. And it actually made the New York Times bestseller list, which was pretty gratifying when you think of military history being on a bestseller list. And then I'm on the speaking circuit still. Anybody that wants me can go to the Washington Speakers Bureau and find out about that. And then do just tons of travel for KKR. I'm typically in 25 different countries every year, some of them many more than one time. So again, very, very busy, and managed to get home on the weekends. And my wife and I have 4 great grandkids as well. So life could not be better, actually. It couldn't be more stimulating. It couldn't be more fulfilling. It couldn't be more enjoyable, although I wish sometimes certainly that there were more than 24 hours in a given day.
Yeah. How do you find yourself managing time? I mean, obviously you have somebody that's helping you on the scheduling side, but how do you prioritize your time and make room for all of this?
Well, I've got the world's greatest executive assistant, Leslie Marin, who's spectacular and with whom you dealt. In fact, she's a senior AA at a relatively youngish age, who manages all of this really quite masterfully. And then, very small staff here beyond that. But it comes down to the priority is what KKR wants and needs me to do first and foremost. And then when there are times in there when you're not engaged in that, then obviously you can bring in some of these other endeavors in which I'm engaged, noting that what I try to do is ensure that they, in a way, reinforce or enable or spread the word on what it is that we do in the KKR Global Institute, which in very simple terms is to provide assessments of geopolitical risk and the ability to mitigate those during the diligence process alongside the deal teams. And we've actually, in somewhere between 5 and 10 cases where the deal team wanted to go ahead, we've actually said that we should not do it because of these certain risks that we have identified that we don't feel comfortable in being able to mitigate. We also support our companies. Once we have bought them, we own about 120 companies around the world. They often own many more. One of them owns 120 companies of its own, Axel Springer, the big European media group. And then we have minority investments in another 100 or so. And so when they run into problems, challenges, trying to anticipate what might happen, all of this, oftentimes my team and I can get out on the ground and help work a way through a particular problem, and have really a very good record in that regard because of the relationships that I've built over decades with various countries, their national security leaders, and so on. And then we do an awful lot with our limited partners, our investors, especially those that are the most significant of them, spending quite a bit of time with them discussing the state of the world as we're all trying to invest in it together and understand what the implications are of what is going on out there. It's not enough to say I'm interested in the war in Ukraine because I commanded a couple of wars. It's that what does that mean for for geopolitics writ large? What does it mean for the global economy? What does it mean for our ability to invest successfully and to have good outcomes? So again, you can gather that this is work that is very, very intellectually stimulating. It does take an enormous amount of focus because you're constantly, you're basically marinating in what's going on in the world, which is what I used to do as a director of the CIA. A lot of people said, well, what a difference this must be. Not really. I did geopolitical risk for the U.S. national security team and our allies, and now I'm doing it for, again, one of the world's largest investment firms. And again, it is very, very enjoyable, or I still wouldn't be doing it at this point in my life.
And where are you able to get your current information? Now I'm sure you have contacts all over the place within the CIA, the military, State Department. Are you getting unclassed readouts? Are you getting classified readouts that you're able to distill down and then share with your investors? How does all that information funnel in?
Again, we basically mine all open source that is out there. Occasionally you'll have private conversations with individuals, but mostly in today's day and age with the ubiquitous nature of smartphones, internet connectivity, and social media or other sites onto which individuals can load videos, photos, statements, and so forth. The challenge is to figure out how do you aggregate this, how do you digest it. So I have a whole number of what I would describe as feeds, just as you do again when you're in the military or in the CIA. The difference is that of course you don't have the classified feeds, but so much is out there that you can do very, very well without that final, if you will, highly sensitive sources information. And that's particularly true if you look at the war in Ukraine, which is the first war ever to have the degree of transparency that this has, in part because everyone on the battlefield has a smartphone. They're taking photos and videos and then uploading them, and they're very, very open about what is going on. And then again, you find those that distill this the best. I'm on the board, for example, of the Institute for the Study of War. In fact, there's the Petraeus Center for Emerging Leaders there, which obviously I'm pretty invested in. But they do the best job of the daily reports on Ukraine and also the war in Gaza and the greater Middle East. And I will often post the key takeaways that they have on my LinkedIn site just to get that word out to individuals. So again, there's plenty of sources out there. I have a whole list of podcasts that I'll at least look at every day. Some I'll listen to every day. The Economist Intelligence is the one that every day, regardless of subject, I will listen to. And then some of the NPR news updates and so forth. Then certain other media certainly go through the Washington Post, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Business Insider, you name it. So you construct all of that. So instead of, when you take over as a CIA director, all these feeds are part of your normal existence, starting with a review first thing in the morning of the Presidential Daily Brief. You just have another set of feeds and input. And we also have individuals on retainer for the KKR Global Institute. We have, as an example, the former Mexican ambassador to the United States who does products for us several times a week. We have a number of other individuals. When we're trying to augment what we have, and we try to be pretty self-aware about our strengths and our shortcomings in the Institute. So then how do you augment that? How do you compensate for that? And we have a variety of means and mechanisms of doing that. And all of us do a great deal of meetings, coffee, lunch, dinner with ambassadors, members of government. And then there's a number of conferences during the course of a year that I'll attend every year. We call it the Battle Rhythm. And it starts fairly early on with a conference in India called Raisina Dialogue. typically the Munich Security Conference. There's a whole series of the summer ones, the Yellowstone Weekend, the Aspen Weekend, the Aspen Security Forum, the Aspen Strategy Group.
Aspen seems popular.
Allen and Company Conference out in, and so on. So you work your way through in the course of a year, and all of these are done. We do them for a reason, and that is that while you're there, in fact, I just got back from the Sedona Forum, which is the annual McCain Institute event out in Sedona, Red Rock country of Arizona, spectacularly beautiful place. And at that conference, there was the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Treasury, a number of senators, other government officials. And so a really great opportunity to, again, talk to Tony Blinken on the margin or what have you. And so this is all done with a fair amount of thinking about what is the most valuable way to spend my time. And then there's just a lot of events as well. Any night that I'm here in New York, we live in Arlington, Virginia, but I have an apartment up here right in Hudson Yards, which is where our office are. And any night, there's always an event of some type that I'm doing. Tonight, it's the Harvard Club, and I think it's basically a book event plus what's called a 4-star tour of the world.
That's an incredibly compact schedule. So I have to ask, your work seems very similar to, I'm sure you've heard of him, Peter Zeihan.
Yes, yeah.
How do you feel about a lot of his assessments? He has a pretty, not necessarily morbid, but detrimental viewpoint of, where Russia's headed, where China's headed, positive for where Mexico's headed. I know you were just talking about, you work with the former Mexican ambassador. Have you heard much about, or do you remember much about what he's saying with their population going down?
I'm afraid I don't. Again, there are certain individuals that I do track quite closely. Don't always agree with them. Fareed Zakaria is one of them. He's also a personal friend. We also attend a number of the same gatherings. I go on his show periodically and so forth. Again, that doesn't mean that we're aligned on everything. As I recall, he was supportive of the decision to withdraw from Afghanistan. I was not. And with Peter, I just don't remember what I don't follow him closely enough. I'm aware that he is a geopolitical pundit, if you will, as we all are. But I'm not sure. It's better just to say, what do you think of this particular situation, rather than what do you think of what Peter Zeihan thinks of it?
Absolutely.
In Mexico, I don't necessarily share. I think we have a pretty nuanced position here at KKR. In fact, I originated the first deal that we did in Mexico. It was with Pemex, a $1.2 billion deal. And there's a colleague here in my office who shepherds the deals in Mexico and some other countries in Latin America. Mexico, in truth, should be doing much better than it is. It's doing well, but it benefits from these enormous, large developments, trends, if you will, themes that it should be able to capitalize on even more than it is. So one of those would obviously be friend shoring. If you're concerned about what's in your supply chain because of the country from which it originates, then put it in Mexico. You also have the benefit then of Mexico, of course, because of the U.S. Mexico-Canada free trade agreement is inside the largest such economic entity in the world, all really anchored around the United States, needless to say, but it benefits enormously from that. And you'll also, and that's the nearshoring. Again, the closer you can get it to the market, needless to say, and then if you can take advantage of the fact that wage costs in Mexico are much less. The problem in Mexico is that it has had years of a deterioration in the rule of law, security, and that is significant. The cartels, if you will, identify them just as, again, drug cartels, illegal narcotics, they're now really criminal empires, and they're so substantial and have such resources and such capabilities when it comes to weapon systems even, that it is increasingly difficult for Mexico to enforce the rule of law. There's been an erosion. Certainly, in some cases, states are dominated by these groups. That's not true, certainly, of Monterrey, which is the manufacturing colossus of Mexico. But even there's some encroachment on what was very effectively done probably somewhere around 10 to 15 years ago, when they got an entire new police force, doubled their salaries, took a lot of other measures that are needed to ensure their safety and security and that of their family members, did reforms in the prisons and also in the judicial system. Again, there's three legs in the rule of law stool: police, prisons, and judiciary. But even there's some erosion now. And this is very worrisome. And as a result, Mexico is not taking full advantage. They're not able to fully capitalize on the extraordinary opportunities that really are there for them, although they are very much benefiting from them. Tesla, Elon Musk was down there not long before I was there a couple months ago and did a $5 billion investment. Chinese EV makers are going to begin producing there as well, so that they're inside the largest economic unit in the world. Certainly going to have to wrestle with some what are called domestic content regulations that are in the USMCA, but they'll work their way through that. So again, huge advantages lie out there for Mexico, but the erosion of the rule of law, and then also, frankly, the populism in government with the current administration, which is closing in on the end of its 6-year term, which has reversed some of the very important reforms that were done by President Lopez Obrador's predecessor, President Peña Nieto. And that's disappointing to see, because it represents really statist economic thinking, and that's generally not good in the long run.
Where do you see them needing to move forward?
Yeah,
to move forward positively.
I didn't get the first part of that.
What steps do you think that they're going to need to take to see a more positive outcome, to take advantage of these opportunities that they have?
Well, I think you'd have less populism in their policies, number one, and then they have to, in a sense, retake lost ground. You might actually think of these criminal empires as insurgents in a way. Yes, they're not Islamist extremist insurgents such as we faced in some of the wars of the post 9/11 period. They're not ideological insurgents, say communists or something like that. They're criminal insurgents, and you have to deal with them in the same way that you deal with an insurgency, which is a comprehensive civil military or civil security force counterinsurgency campaign in which you clear, hold, and build. And you just try to work out from the oil spot, if you will, in other words, the area in which you have achieved security, and separate the bad guys from the population. And it's very hard work. It takes enormous resources to do that, as we learned, of course, during the surge in Iraq, and then to a lesser degree Afghanistan, which is much less an urban setting and much more of a rural insurgency. But it's very similar practices and approaches, albeit some that differ, needless to say. But this is hard, because these guys will fight you back. They're very heavily armed, well equipped, and they have enormous resources. So what's happened is Mexican presidents who only have 1 6-year term, especially if they've changed parties, so they went from, say, PRI to PAN to the current party in power, it takes them a year or so to understand the magnitude of the problem. And then they look at it and they say, oh man, I've got 4 or 5 years left. How much can I do in that time? Because again, they're going to fight you back. It gets much worse before it gets better. But that's what they need to do. And I've talked to now 3 presidents in a row about these issues. Actually, not much with Lopez Obrador, but his 2 predecessors. And again, the amount of resources required is very, very significant. And you have a country that generally has been quite fiscally responsible. And this could put a pretty big dent in that particular objective.
How does the U.S. border policy play into this at all?
Well, the biggest way probably is that you can get stuff into the United States pretty easily, number one, including various forms of evil, in particular illegal narcotics, some of which, of course, are manufactured with components or items that are brought from China. But it also means that you have a huge number of people passing through your country. People are really desperate to get to the United States. The fact that someone will fly into the northern part of South America, then transit through this very treacherous area, very, very difficult, and put yourself in the hands of these essentially organizations. They're also criminal activities that, of course, you pay to get you to the border and then across it. And the treatment's not always all that kindly. And then work your way up after getting through the Darien, this almost trackless area, then through the Central American countries to Mexico, and ultimately across the border. But what it means is you just have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people in that process at any given time. And then, of course, they're able to get into the United States. I mean, we really need comprehensive immigration reform across the board. And unfortunately, our dysfunction in Congress has prevented the parties from agreeing on that.
Speaking about like the U.S. in general and KKR, what is your guys' geopolitical assessment of the U.S. look like, and how has that changed over the last couple of years?
Well, it's the greatest economy in the world. It continues just because of the nature of our various systems, whether it's rule of law, various legal norms, the incentives that are there. We continually reinvent ourselves. And I should have noted earlier, I'm also a personal venture capitalist. I'm invested in 28 or 29 startups and actually a VC firm and so on. So in many of these multiple rounds, so it's not just the seed round or but sometimes seed A, B, C, and so on. And I track these companies closely. And I enjoy that because it gives me great optimism that you have these great young leaders who have powerful big ideas, and they can execute the 4 tasks of a strategic leader, which is a leader at the very top, which they are, even if they're tiny. That leader at the top has to perform the same 4 tasks that I had to perform as the commander of the surge in Iraq. You have to get the big ideas right. You have to craft the right strategy. That comes from understanding all the elements of the context in which you're engaged in conflict. It's your forces, the enemy forces, it's all the other elements of society. It's the physical terrain, the human terrain, the neighborhood, all of that. Craft the right strategy. You then have to communicate the big ideas effectively through the breadth and depth of the organization and to all those who have a stake in the outcome of that endeavor. You then have to oversee the implementation of the big ideas, which is the example the leader provides, the energy, the inspiration. It's attracting great people and retaining them. It's letting those not measuring up to move on to something else. It's the organizational architecture that you develop. In very few situations are the same. Even when it comes to war, there's always differences in what the architecture is for, say, Iraq versus what it is for Afghanistan because of the different nature of the context. It is how you spend your time, your battle rhythm. That's crucially important because you drive the execution of the big ideas of a campaign plan by the meetings that you do, by the actions you undertake, going out to see it for yourself twice a week as the commander of the surge or in Afghanistan. It's the frequency, the subjects, how you drive this thing is done, again, through the use of your time, how you structure your battle rhythm. And then it's the metrics. How do you know if you're winning or losing? And these have to be very rigorous. They have to be clearly defined. You have to understand the sources of the information for them and so on. And I did that with enormous focus in the early months in the surge in Iraq. Even brought over a Rhodes Scholar PhD from the Air Force Academy who is a data science expert and just drilled into these numbers very, very firmly. And then there's a 4th task, which is facilitated by events on your battle rhythm. And that is to determine how you need to refine the big ideas, what lessons you should be taking from what's going on so that you can refine the big ideas, change them, bring new ones, let old ones go away, and so forth, and do the process again and again and again. And again, a startup founder does this, and I get really energized by startup founders who have a great big idea and also seem to have the potential to lead an organization as it scales. So they're not just the person programming for 48 hours straight. Also have to be able to build and lead an organization and scale it. And that's what gives me confidence in the United States. And again, the fact that you get to keep a good bit of what it is that you generate. Look at the energy revolution, for example. The only place in the world where you have had what we have had, which is this extraordinary growth in production of crude and natural gas. We went from being at what was at that time told peak production, peak oil of about 5 million barrels a day to somewhere in the neighborhood of 14 million barrels per day, the largest producer by far in the world, and the same with natural gas. And the reasons that the energy revolution happened here are that we invented the technology of deep directional drilling, hydraulic fracturing, and seismic big data, among others. We have laws that allow individuals to sell the minerals under land that they own. It's actually quite rare around the world. There are not that many countries where you actually can sell what's underneath the land that you own. We have the wildcatters who can build this out very quickly. We have agile capital markets. We have reasonable infrastructure for pushing it around. And yes, we have sources of water near the oil and gas that's in the tight rock that has to be hydraulically fractured. Nowhere else in the world do you find all of those elements, and therefore nowhere else in the world do you find the kind of production that we have in the United States. And so you can identify very clearly the systemic factors that have enabled the energy revolution to take place in the United States. And you can do largely the same for a number of other industries and startups and innovative developments.
With the industries that you invest in, do you have a specific area that you focus on?
No. I mean, it's across the board. If it's
Okay.
something that, and I'm not an expert in virtually any of these, so you're trying to assess it for yourself. Certainly, you can ask individuals that have more expertise than you do. Whether this AI company really can revolutionize data centers or call centers the way that ASAP, which I've invested in since the Seed series, is doing actually. Or say Mark 43, which is the greatest police software platform in the world, hugely impressive founder who used to do ride-alongs. He was a Harvard student, and he'd go out to LAPD and do ride-alongs all summer. So he understood the ecosystem and the challenges that they had in entering information into computers eventually, and then storing it, recalling it, using it, manipulating it, and so on. And they've done a magnificent job as well. And obviously I've had some that have gone bust, and then I've had some that have done exceedingly well. There was one in Israel, which was founded by an individual that I knew well because he was one of the great cyber experts in the world, without getting into specifically what he did. And he was the deputy director of Mossad. His Mossad director, my counterpart, was the chairman of the company. I said, you don't even need to say anymore. Just save this amount of spot for me, and I'll trust you to. And we got, I think that was 8.5x within 3 years or something like that. But again, I think America has a critical mass of this capability, and it's why we have Silicon Valley, Silicon Beach, LA, Silicon Hills, Austin, Silicon Alley, New York, and then a bunch of others out there as well. It's because of the systems, the laws, the ecosystem that we have in the United States, which is still pretty unique. It doesn't mean that there aren't some hubs of innovation in some other countries, but none of them have what we have here.
And are you working with the founders that you invest in? Are you mentoring them, training them up on how to lead these organizations, how to scale them, insights that you have from the military side that'll be beneficial as a organizational leader?
Yeah, to a degree. Again, I'm not a subject matter expert most times. Occasionally there might be an area, but mostly it's about how to be a strategic leader. So in fact, if listeners want to get more on this, they can go to the belfercenter.org. It's the Belfer Center at Harvard. And there's when you get to belfourcenter.org, search for Petraeus on strategic leadership, and there's an entire website that I built with a number of graduate students who had served for me in the war zones that lays out these 4 tasks in considerably more detail, and then also talks about the tactics, techniques, and procedures of strategic leadership, and a whole series of different ideas on that as well.
Okay. Have you came across any veteran founders?
Sure. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, including our daughter-in-law, Roxanne.
Oh, nice.
She was Harvard, Afghanistan under a rucksack, one of the initial female engagement teams that would go out with infantry units so that they could talk to the women as well as to the men in these villages. Rhodes Scholar and special ops at that time. It was civil affairs was all that women could do, but deployed to Southeast Asia a couple of times there, and then did a startup, and then McKinsey, and then the second startup, Ethena, which is doing quite well. I think the last valuation a few years ago in its series, whatever it was, B or C, was I think $200 million, and it has continued to grow nicely ever since. So, yeah, there's tons of veterans out there, and there are certain groups headed by veterans that support veteran founders, and I do events for them. In fact, Roxanne and I did one together on stage before a gathering of this particular group.
With you mentioned working with the Israeli Mossad. Jumping over to that topic now, how do you see the situation in the U.S. with the pro-Palestinian protests that are really diverting away from the administration's efforts of trying to support Israel, support the right to defend themselves, but also do so in a controlled manner?
Well, obviously, it's gotten a bit out of hand on some of the campuses, and I think this is really about strategic leadership again. In those universities where you have laid out what the standards are, you don't necessarily have the same rights on a college campus that you have outside it. Outside, you can say all kinds of nasty things, as long as you don't cross a certain line, but that shouldn't be necessarily applauded, much less allowed in campuses where you're part of a community, which after all should be about reasoned discourse and discussion and perhaps even arguments, if you will, but not threatening, not hate speech, certainly not violence, trespassing, and so forth. And I think the universities where you have seen the right strategic leadership, where they have laid out that when you enter that gate, you're part of a community. This community does not permit this, this, and this. And if you do it, we will enforce it and not shrink from that and not dither and temporize. You look at what Arizona State University has done, and a great strategic leader, Michael Crow. And yes, they had some demonstrations. Yes, they had some people trying to do a camp out. And at the end of the day, when it was clear that they're not allowed to stay overnight, it was dismantled. And we'll see what transpires, as opposed to these others where they have seemed timid about confronting something that really should be unacceptable, regardless of your views about Israel, Palestinians, any other subject. But there have to be very clear lines about what is acceptable and what is not. And I thought it was interesting, that very first hearing, as you'll recall, of 3 college presidents, 3 university presidents, who really seemed as if they were trying to give the most legalistic answer possible, instead of just very clearly stating that anti-Semitism is not allowed on our campus. Those who engage in it will be examined, and perhaps action will be taken against them, up to and including being fired if you're a faculty member, or having your college education suspended, or perhaps even being thrown out. And again, I think those universities where this has been done properly, you have not seen these issues. And it's a very clear-cut case, in my view, of a case of strategic leadership. Princeton, my graduate school alma mater, where I did a PhD, has done this quite well, I think. I think the president there has been very clear. They did have some demonstrators. And again, quite firmly, they were not allowed to continue doing what it was that they were doing, which violated the standards at that university. There are other examples as well.
Mm-hmm. And are you guys seeing any indication that there are outside instigators, paid
no question
writers?
about it. Yeah, no question. No, every one of the university presidents I've talked to, and again, I was just at the Sedona Forum, McCain Institute. In fact, President Crow was there, and some others. All the inference in most cases is that it is at least a third, if not more, who are from the outside. And frankly, having been targeted by some of these groups that turned out to be actually professional demonstrators that would then get a handful of students to augment them. That's what some of them do this for a living. Others do it as an avocation, and have found that university campuses are places where they can really stir things up. So yeah, that's the experience. Is that in some cases as much as 40% are not students.
Where are we seeing the
salary
funding
is like for those guys?
What was that?
Sorry, I was wondering where the funding, if you guys have been able to track where the funding for these
I don't know.
from.
Again, it depends on the organization. I remember one of those that used to go after me periodically. I think it was MoveOn.org, and it just had general funding. Again, people that were generally aligned with their views. I don't know that it was state funded in any case, as in other countries. Although, again, there are certainly efforts by other countries without question. We know this. They've been caught doing it, that try to essentially put gasoline on burning embers, and to foster greater differences, greater discord, undermine democracy, and so forth. And again, we've seen that. We've seen countries that have sought to magnify the differences that exist, have sought to put a finger on the scales of an election, and not just in the U.S., of course, but in a number of other countries as well.
Where do you see the conflict in Israel headed?
Well, I don't think I'd put the chances of a ceasefire right now as even. I think it's less than likely. And even if there is a temporary ceasefire during which some additional of the hostages are freed in return for numbers of Hamas prisoners, I don't think that that's the end of the conflict. I was just over there a few weeks ago. I'm quite close to one of the members of the war cabinet. We correspond and talk periodically. And my sense is that they feel that they have to go and finish off the final 4 or so of the original 24 battalions of Hamas, battalion consisting of several companies each of which has 150-ish, give or take, soldiers in it. That they have to finish this off, that they cannot be allowed to stay combat effective, that they're determined to destroy Hamas, and that in doctrinal terms means to render it incapable of accomplishing its mission without reconstitution, dismantling the political wing. It can never again rule Gaza, and also get the hostages back. The challenge is that I think there needs to be more than that, and I have discussed this with Israeli leaders, and they understand that, but there are significant challenges to doing it. Really, this should have long since transitioned to a counterinsurgency campaign, such as what we did in the cities in Iraq during the surge, where we finally got Fallujah right the third time, Ramadi, Baquba, Mosul, parts of Baghdad, etc. Now, keep in mind that the situation in Gaza is fiendishly more difficult than all those put together, because of the magnitude of the underground infrastructure. 350 miles at least of substantial tunneling, literally bases underground, headquarters, manufacturing facilities, and so forth. And then just the sheer density of the population. So again, very, very tough. But nonetheless, you have to clear, hold, and build, as we actually discussed about the situation in Mexico. And the way to do that is to use what we called gated communities, where, for example, Fallujah, which I think was roughly 300,000 at most when we cleared it the final time and then held it. First, we had literally put a wall all the way around the city and had one entry control point, which meant you had to go through bomb-sniffing dogs, X-ray machines, and so forth. And then we created roughly 12 neighborhoods inside Fallujah, each of which was essentially gated with huge walls augmenting whatever infrastructure you have. And with entry control points for each of those neighborhoods, biometric ID cards issued to the residents so that you could truly separate the people from the extremists. In that case, they were the Al-Qaeda and some of the more virulent Sunni insurgent groups. And we painstakingly cleared every building, every floor, every room, every cellar and everything else without, of course, again, having the kind of underground infrastructure that Israel contends with in Gaza. But that's the way you go about it. There are several problems with that. It requires a very substantial number of troops, and I'm not sure Israel can generate those because they can't afford to do what they did at the outset, which is have 7% of their workforce in uniform. And it's a conscript army, of course, at the end of the day. And they've never done anything like this. They've never done a counterinsurgency. They have done punitive raids into urban areas and typically pulled out, at least not in recent decades. And there's no doctrine for it. So you have to, again, get the idea, the big ideas right, got to communicate them through the breadth and depth of the organization and execute them. And again, it's about clear, hold, and then build, rebuild, repair the damage, restore basic services, flood areas with humanitarian assistance, et cetera, get people back into their homes. And this should be all founded on a public commitment to making life better for the Palestinian civilians in Gaza. But again, it takes very substantial numbers of troops and a variety of other requirements to do what I'm talking about here. I mean, it could include, for example, starting by just walling off the northern third of Gaza, put a few entry control points into it, flood the north with humanitarian assistance, keep working on the remaining Hamas extremists in that area, and then keep Hamas from re-infiltrating it. Because if you don't do that, you end up with what Israelis had to contend with recently, which was a need to go back into Al-Shifa Hospital, an installation they had already cleared one time, but into which then Hamas was able to re-infiltrate in the hundreds, really probably almost a battalion size, and they had to go back in and re-clear it and so forth, and really don't have the hold force there. So again, I've had conversations with Israeli leaders about this, about how they could go about it if they can generate the resources to do it. If you don't do that, you're somewhat doomed to have to go back into areas repeatedly, because even though they have destroyed the first 19 or 20 of the 24 battalions, nonetheless, they can reconstitute if you are not there, and that means you have to essentially live with the people again. I don't mean reoccupying in terms of civilians back in Gaza, but there has to be a security force present. And one of the biggest of the big ideas for the surge was that we had to secure and serve the people, and we could only do that by living with them, going back into the neighborhoods from which we had been withdrawing for the previous 2 years and consolidated on big basis. And then, as I said, we created gated communities, had very good security. And then it just sort of one thing reinforces the other in an upward spiral, where citizens see you there, you're there 24 hours a day, you're walking the streets, they will give you a tip. You know, this is where this bad guy is. You get the bad guy, they're more relieved. Now someone invests in the local market, it starts coming back to life because they have a prospect of security. We rebuild the school and the health clinic, patch up the roads that have been blown up, the bridges and so forth. And again, it just sort of continues upward. And pretty soon the people have a stake in your success. And because your success is their success. Now, much more difficult in Gaza, to be sure. The people are much less on the fence about the forces that are clearing their areas of bad guys. But hearts and minds do matter. And at the very least, you don't want to harden those or create more enemies by the way you carry out an operation than you actually take off the streets. And in fact, I used to have a sign staring me in the face. You know, I had 5 combat commands as a general officer, and there was always a sign on the wall staring me in the face that asked a question: will this operation take more bad guys off the street than it creates by its conduct? If the answer to that is no, you have to retool that to get to yes, or you think really hard before you do it. There would have to be some real serious military reason, and there are. in combat, as you know, and they're particularly difficult in urban settings because of the presence of large numbers of people, although Israel has tried very hard to get them out of the way, taking actions far beyond what we ever did, dropping leaflets, doing text messages, loudspeakers, everything else, warning them that a military operation is coming, and please get out of the area. But that didn't always persuade the people sufficiently to clear out.
And with Iran jumping in to play its hand in all this, trying to cause some regional upheaval, how do you see the U.S.-Israeli alliance getting Iran
very strong? It's going to remain strong, as are the partnerships that we have with the Gulf Cooperation Council countries and others. But it does make the situation in Iraq much more difficult because the Iranian-supported Shia militia are trying to push the prime minister to have us withdraw our forces, even though they're really needed to help the Iraqi security forces, especially their special operations forces, to continue the pressure on the remnants of the Islamic State, which of course we helped them destroy and clear out of Mosul and other areas, as well as over in northeastern Syria. That's important because if you take your eye off that, as the Iraqis did after our final combat forces were withdrawn in late 2011, you can see the bad guys reconstitute. And in that case, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which we destroyed during the surge, morphed into the Islamic State. It was able to reconstitute, and within a couple of years, you had the first ever Islamist extremist caliphate in northern Iraq, centered on Mosul, the city where we spent the first year when I was commander of the 101st Airborne Division, and then around Raqqa in northeastern Syria. All of those have been cleared. The units have been destroyed, but there are still remnants. And if you allow them to, they will reconstitute. And our presence helps the Iraqis very much. You also see the very nefarious effect of various Iranian elements propping up Bashar al-Assad, the murderous dictator of Syria, causing problems for Lebanon with Lebanese Hezbollah, which is a very, very robust organization, has some 150,000 or so rockets and other projectiles pointed at Israel. And then, of course, the Houthis, the Yemeni Shia, who are disrupting the freedom of navigation through the Red Sea. So again, a very nefarious, we used to have three truths about the Middle East when I was commanding U.S. Central Command, which of course is responsible for the greater Middle East, all the way to Pakistan in the west, to Egypt in the east. All the way from Egypt in the west to Pakistan in the east, Kazakhstan in the north, and the Yemen and the pirate-infested waters of Somalia in the south. And we used to say, number one, in the Middle East, you have to know who your enemies are and who your friends are, and don't ever confuse one for the other. Iran is our enemy, and Israel's our friend, even if we don't always agree on everything or align on everything. Number two is that Las Vegas rules don't apply in the Middle East. What happens there does not stay there. Rather, it tends to spew violence, extremism, instability, and in some cases, a tsunami of refugees, not just into neighboring countries, but all the way into countries of our European NATO allies. And then number three, which observes that the U.S. trying to leave the Middle East, which we keep trying to do, the U.S. trying to leave the Middle East is a little like Michael Corleone trying to leave the mafia. You just keep getting sucked back in. And so you might as well just acknowledge that, maintain the minimum essential force. You can augment it if necessary, but at times we've minimized our presence to a greater extent than I have felt that we should have. It's very, very important for our national interests, and really the national interests of the entire world and the global economy.
How much do you think our withdrawal from Afghanistan has to do with all the instability we're seeing around the world right now?
Well, what has happened, and I said that when this was announced, of course, the previous administration did the agreement for our departure with the Taliban, one of the worst diplomatic deals in our history. And then the current administration agreed to follow suit with that. They delayed the departure date a bit, but they agreed to implement that. And I said when it was publicly announced that I believed we would come to regret the decision, and I believe we have. The Our enemy took over the country. This is the enemy that allowed Al Qaeda to have a sanctuary there in the past. And now we see various extremist groups actually using some of the more ungoverned areas there as sanctuaries. The Khorasan group of the Islamic State, and Khorasan is a region that's greater than Afghanistan. It also would include some of the countries, some or all of the countries on their periphery. But they carried out that horrific attack in Moscow, the intelligence of which we shared, as you may recall, because of our policy of duty to warn. No matter who it is, friend or foe, you're going to give them notice that an attack could be imminent. But we see, again, Afghanistan clearly being used again as a location in which you can train, equip extremists, and then plan operations, inspire, and so on, just as we saw the Islamic State of Iraq and al-Sham, the Levant, do when it had its caliphate in northern Iraq and northeastern Syria, and was directing, inspiring, enabling attacks in Western Europe, including in Paris and Brussels, as you'll recall. So that's a very worrisome development. Moreover, of course, the country is very, very large segments of the country are starving. The economy has collapsed. Women, 50% of the population can do very little productive outside the house without a male guardian, and so on. And so many of those that helped us, who qualify for a special immigrant visa because they were battlefield interpreters, they and their family members qualify, are still there. Probably over 140,000 of them, about somewhere around 25,000 of the former interpreters. And these are individuals that share risk and hardship with our soldiers on the ground. And our son was a rifle platoon leader there. You know, the Terp was with him all the time. And they do multiple tours because they have typically would do years of this. And we have not met our moral obligation to them, much less all the others who were in government positions or military or security positions, some of whom now are trying to evade the Taliban locating them and killing them.
And I want to jump into it because I know you spent enormous amounts of time authoring the book. Where do you see the Ukraine situation, or how do you see the Ukraine situation playing out?
Well, it depends. And I just did a piece really a couple of months ago for foreignpolicy.com where they asked me whither Ukraine, and the answer, the title was, it depends. At that time, it depended first and foremost on the U.S. finally taking action on Capitol Hill to approve the security assistance that was so desperately needed, $61 billion. That's very important. It has been approved, obviously, by Congress and signed into law by the president. Also included in that package was assistance for Israel and Taiwan. Again, very, very significant. It depends on how well the Ukrainians can generate additional forces. They had really quite a different policy on conscription than we have. Our frontline soldiers typically are 19 to 22 or so. Theirs were over 40 because they don't even conscript someone until the age of 27. They believe that the men, it's largely men, should be able to get an education, start a family, and then they can be susceptible to this. They have reduced the age of that to 25, and they've made a number of other changes to enable them to generate additional forces. And that's very important now, the actual implementation of that, needless to say. It depends on continued strong European support. I think that's a given that can be counted on. The Europeans have been very serious about this, contrary to the ways we've typically criticized them in the past for not spending enough on defense. An substantially increased number now do spend the 2% on defense that NATO countries agreed to, some good bit more than that. And a number of the countries individually have been supporting Ukraine very heavily, in addition to the EU overall, passing a $50 billion support package just before the Munich Security Conference a few months ago. It depends on Russia continuing to generate even more forces than Ukraine can, noting, of course, the challenge here for Ukraine is that they have less than 1/3 the population of Russia and less than 1/10 the economy. of Russia. And Russia doesn't seem particularly concerned or fazed by the terrible casualties their soldiers are taking in what are sometimes essentially human wave attacks. So there's again a competition there between who can generate forces. It depends on technology. Ukraine has very expertly used and produced a combination of aerial drones, maritime drones, and then long-range anti-ship missiles to destroy over 30% of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. And the Russians can't replace those losses because of the Montreux Convention, which prohibits transit of the Bosphorus, controlled by Turkey, of course, at a time of war. And Turkey is enforcing that. And that's forced the Russians to withdraw from the Western Black Sea, including the very important port that they've had for centuries of Sevastopol on the Crimean Peninsula. And that allowed Ukraine to export grain. And since they're 25% of the world's export market, it really helps Egypt, on who depends very heavily on Ukraine for its food security. So, and then there's a variety of other factors in there involving other technologies, and there's an electronic warfare race that's going on. And then Ukraine getting the pipeline filled back up so that it can start shooting one round for every round of the Russians instead of one for every 10 Russian rounds. Get the air defense interceptors stocked back up again, because there have been some cases in which the Russians have been able to get through the air and ballistic missile defenses. So those are the factors that will determine going forward how Ukraine turns out. But this year, I wouldn't expect more than just stabilizing the front lines, which have been eroding slowly, but and incrementally, and very costly for the Russians. But they have been gradually losing ground. I think they can stabilize that, solidify their defenses, and then if some of the technology comes through, they can make some kind of breakthrough, ideally that would change the entire dynamic, but at the very least, again, would keep Russia from taking more of their territory. Russia has about 20% of their territory at this point.
Thank you. So I know we're running low on time. One final question I'd love to get from some of your statures. What is your book list looking like right now? What are the top few books that you would recommend to anybody looking to stay current with events going on and just general good knowledge?
Well, it sort of depends on, again, the subject and so forth. I found Chip Wars recently to be very, very good. This is the biggest competition in the world. Whoever can master the design and manufacturing of the most capable chips has an enormous advantage, and that lays out all the dynamics. And that my shipmate Admiral Jim Stavridis has a new book out on essentially a futuristic novel that I find very instructive. And frankly, most recently, what I've been focused on is the second edition of Conflict, the evolution of warfare from 1945 to Ukraine, again with Andrew Roberts, because we had to add a chapter on Gaza and then in the greater Middle East, and we updated considerably the chapter on Ukraine. So that has been occupying me quite a bit as well. But there's a number of others out there, and I have somewhat eclectic views, and I'll read fiction as well as nonfiction.
And that book's available on Amazon, any other place you recommend people find it?
It is, yeah. It was an Amazon bestseller as well. Yep.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. It's been incredibly insightful.
Pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Great to see you.